Welcome to the Mind for Success podcast. I'm your host, Kimberly Lebbing, and I love seeing business professionals, leaders, and entrepreneurs have massive success in their businesses. Are you ready to reach a higher level in your business? Are you looking to rise to the top and break through the barriers that are holding you back? If this is you, join us on the Mind for Success podcast. Welcome to the Mind for Success podcast. I am super excited to introduce our guest today that has a very unique niche in what he does. His name is Healy, and he is a market designer and game theorist working on better economic systems. After training in nuclear engineering, he worked for tech startups at the peak of the dot-com boom. He's becoming fascinated by the mathematics of information and computation, led to patent work on a better commodity market design. And I'm excited for you to listen to him today because one, he's super smart, and the concept that he is putting together, or this business that he's put together, it's really mind-blowing, and I'm going to let him explain it to you. So welcome, Noah, to the podcast.
Thank you, Kim, for having me here.
You are quite welcome. So I'd love for you to start and just tell us a little bit about your company and your background and kind of why you're doing what you're doing.
Sure. Well, the company is founded basically as an IP shell. So I have an idea which is developed into a system, and then in order to bring things like that into the world these days, entrepreneurship is how we do things. So having a business and a company for that business as an identity is how people interact with those sorts of ideas, and so that's what got me into entrepreneurship. In terms of what it does, marketplaces are financial institutions, and their, I guess, most important feature is something called price discovery. That is the finding and publishing of price information, the price which balances supply and demand.
Okay.
Now, in order to get to that point, they also have to be able to serve a number of other functions in terms of quality control and settlement, assuring that the same dollar isn't spent twice, that things that are being sold are up to whatever standard that they're supposed to be sold and are actually available, and so on. But the critical piece, sort of the reason why all the rest of the infrastructure is there, is this price discovery mechanism. And what I have is a brand new way to do that price discovery, which is significantly simpler at global scale than the method that we use right now.
Okay. So taking that, I want our listeners to really understand what you're doing. So explain to us, what does that mean? So how you're taking this on a global scale, or how can that help somebody that's in this market?
Right. So I guess I'll start with how things are today.
Okay.
The market presently works by letting people stand in line to buy or sell. And in fact, because it's sort of holding places in line, you can be in both lines at the same time if you want to be. And typically for commodities, because they're sort of large and bulky and heavy and, slow to move around. We don't trade them directly. What we do is we trade futures. We trade contracts that agree to trade them at some point in the future. And so what the market does is it sets up about one time period per month for when trades will settle. And this gives it a kind of rough estimate of how prices will evolve into the future. And then there's some infrastructure that lets people actually physically engage in trade on more or less a daily basis that uses these prices, sort of the prices that you're in between, as a guide to help you out. And so these two lines are looking for the point at which they cross. If the people at the front of the two lines actually want to trade with one another, so that they want to buy for more than the other person wants to sell for less than the other person wants to buy for, then the market matches them off at sort of the deal that they've reached together and publishes that information. It says, hey, somebody just did this. They sold, 4 units at this much, or they bought 10,000 units at that much. However, computers being what they are, what's going on is they have exactly regimented time slices to do this in, and exactly regimented price slices to do this in. And so what winds up happening is that your point in line is usually shared with other people. So maybe you wanted to buy something at $2.18, a unit for 10,000 of those units at some particular microsecond during the day. There might be demand at that price for hundreds of times your personal amount that all came in at the exact same microsecond that your personal request came in at. And so if that chunk of time and interest were to get to the front of the line and actually trade, your part of it might be the part that actually trades. Or maybe it isn't. Maybe depending on how they settle within that chunk, all or maybe only part or theoretically none of your trade might actually settle. If you're a small enough player, it might not really be practical for any of yours to come in. So if there's 10,000 units that all want to be on one side and one interest comes in on the other side, then it's sort of a raffle at that point. Somebody gets to be the person that trades. You've got one out of the 10,000 tickets in the raffle. Maybe somebody else has 100, or somebody else has 1,000. Maybe you win that and maybe you don't, but it's just sort of a random draw at that point.
So it sounds like there's a lot of frustration and waiting in the current system.
Well, because of computers and because we're actually talking about microseconds, there isn't so much waiting, but there's a great deal of frustration. When I speak to people who are operating their businesses off of these, so if you're in agriculture or in mining, these institutions define the entire income of your business. And when you talk to people who are in those businesses, they're very dissatisfied by sort of how unpredictable and tumultuous it is. They will tend to be on the smaller side compared to these types of exchanges. And it's very hard for them to sort of figure out what's going on. And the number one reason, in fact, usually the only reason you can get any of them to say that why they do this is because they have no choice.
Right.
These systems have existed for, depending on sort of which country and which industry you're in, decades to centuries. Everybody does it that way. There's no practical way to develop client lists outside that, particularly for small to medium-sized players. And so that's it. That's
Okay.
just how
Okay.
the world is constructed.
So in my head, I'm thinking, I grew up on a farm, and I'm thinking about how, and now this was before computers and that were really, prevalent. So there was a waiting period, but I'm thinking about the price of a bushel of corn or wheat, so is that what you're referring to? And
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. So thank you, because that made the connection for me because of the way I grew up, and even the price of pork or beef, all those things are determined by whatever the market says.
Yeah, and it wasn't that long ago. Computerization got started at different points in different marketplaces. But my grandfather was a lobbyist in the dairy industry, and one of the stories he had was about where the butter market used to be. There used to be a butter market in, I think he said Wisconsin, and it traded once a week. And it was a few dozen guys would trade a couple 100 pounds of butter once a week. And so it was actually pretty possible. You could go up there with a few cases of butter or a big stack of Benjamins, and you could change effectively the entire global butter price for 7 days. But you couldn't keep it changed, because if you went up and kind of flipped out and doubled the price of butter or something, then if you wanted to leave it there, you were going to have to buy all the butter on earth for the new doubled price.
Right.
They were going to come and they were going to sell it to you if that's what you want, but make it be. And so prices stayed relatively same. And again, if you're on the farm, your actual sort of practical sell through, a lot of it's going to be to the grain elevator operator, and then they're going to set the price that's based on the prices that are coming off of the marketplace. And then they're going to be able to have the volume to be able to, segregate individual train or truckloads, which are the size that the market, contracts in. They're not buying corn by the ear. They need an entire boxcar's worth before they're
Right.
So yeah, so that structure is how it's done now.
Okay.
And so what I have found is a different way to find that price that people are going to be willing to agree upon. And what it gets down to is being able to measure in bits effectively how much sentiment between different people differs. So I'm going to get a little nerdy and technical, but
Okay.
Prices change over time. So you get this price time curve, and each of those curves is what we call in mathematics a function. A function is, maybe you saw this in school. It's just some kind of curve in space that never doubles back on itself. So there's never two different prices at one time. And so the space of functions is very, very large, because for every point, there's an infinite number of possible points that could be associated with it. And since a function is itself effectively an infinite number of points, when you can associate an infinite number of numbers with each infinite point, you wind up with this really, really big outcome space. But we can measure these things by effectively taking their log difference. So the way you do this is you take the two numbers, you divide one by the other. Since all prices are positive, you wind up with some other positive number. You take a logarithm and then take the absolute value of that logarithm. And that gives you, if the log base is 2, that gives you how many bits different those two numbers are.
Okay.
You can actually measure in other units. There's a thing called nats, which are like bits, but they're, if you're familiar with the natural logarithm or e to the x, they are e-size questions instead of 2-size questions.
Okay.
But it doesn't matter what the base is. This sort of absolute logarithm function allows you on a point-by-point basis to figure out how different two functions are. And so what my system does is it allows people to tell it what their belief about the future will be and measure their differences from a common consensus, take on investment based on those differences, and effectively integrate your beliefs into an updated common consensus. And so what this does is it creates a multipolar negotiation where the goal is to find the agreement point among all people. But unlike sort of the negotiation that's taking place in the existing market, where the winner is sort of determined by who can hold out the longest for the best deal, in this case, you win by driving the entire system towards its common consensus as quickly as possible. And so instead of having this tug of war, which stabilizes as the two sides sort of grow up to become the same strength, but is capable of being wildly unstable if there's a little bit of slippage, we get this sort of build-up type of a system, which stabilizes over time instead of destabilizing over time. And because of this obverse incentive structure, we create a system that is a lot less expensive to operate, and that savings then passes out to the users of that system in higher rates of return for the kinds of businesses that they're in.
Okay. So explain, because that was a lot. Explain. It is. So explain, like, how is this going to affect the people that are in the commodity space? Like what would this mean for them?
Well, so you talked about, growing up on a farm. Farming margins are pretty low. Commodity production margins in general are quite low because it's a competitive space.
Right.
If you figure out some brand new way to make corn that's wildly profitable, then people will learn what that is. In fact, it's pretty normal in farming communities for people to, show off their innovations and tell other people what they're up to. And so other people will start also using this technique to make corn, and the entire marketplace will shift. And because everyone's now using the same technique, they'll chew each other's margins up, and you'll wind up back at being a fairly low margin business. So somewhere in the mid-teens is a pretty average marginal operation for a farm, which means that an American farming family that has sort of a median household of say $70,000 would be producing something like $500,000 worth of product.
Wow, that's significant.
Yes. I have cousins.
So just, yeah, that's huge.
Yes, I have cousins who farm, and they're, the size of the checks that they write compared to the size of the lifestyle they live is enormous. They're earning hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars a year, and then they're paying hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars a year to be able to earn that.
Right.
And because it's at the margins, things can really shift. Amazon had a series they put on with Jeremy Clarkson that he had produced during the year of COVID, where he lived in Western England, which has been a rural community for millennia, and he lived on a working farm, and he decided as part of this thing that he would actually do the work rather than, have this sort of jet-setting television producing lifestyle. He'd have the camera crews come in and follow him around, and he'd make all his funny jokes or whatever. Well, it was a bad year. They had, massive flooding, and then, massive heat wave and all kinds of other stuff.
Right.
And so at the end of the series, the sort of climax is he sits down with his accountant and tots up how he did for the year. And I think the farm in general made like 50,000 pounds. And that year, because he's incompetent, he was learning. That's part of what makes the show funny, because they had really bad weather. He made 144 pounds.
Wow.
Now, obviously, he could afford that.
Right.
And this is after expenses. It's not the total revenue of the farm.
Right.
But that's a bad year, obviously. If you spent the entire year and you made $150, maybe. Right. Maybe you wouldn't actually keep doing that in your office job. So these sorts of things are what confront farmers at sort of the back end. It's not the biggest, but one major cost is opportunity costs. If farmers were able to navigate the markets effectively, perfectly, and get the best deals that could ever have been available by perfectly timing their trades or whatnot, conceivably, and it's different for different markets, but they would be able to save transaction costs somewhere between 5 and 15%. So for this theoretical $500,000 farm, somewhere, depending on what it is that they're farming, between $25,000 and $75,000 is getting chewed up in that selling process.
In that system.
The brokers, just mistakes. They sold it on Wednesday at 325.000571 seconds instead of exactly the right time that they should have
Okay.
sold at. And so that if you're sort of scraping off tens of thousands of dollars when you're making tens of thousands of dollars, if a system that didn't cost as much existed, that instead of costing you $25,000 cost $5,000, then you would go from making maybe $70,000 to making $90,000.
Yeah.
And so that, because the margins are low, there's a multiplying effect for what happens to scraping off small changes there. So if you're operating at 14-15% margins, then every point that you shave off your transaction costs is a 7-point improvement in your actual revenues. If you're operating at around 10% margins, which is what like petroleum companies like Exxon and Shell operate, every point that you shave off your transaction costs is a 10-point increase in your operating. So the more marginal you are, the closer to the knuckle you're operating, the greater value would come to you. If you're sort of a bad farmer, say, and we're operating somehow at 7% margins, which ranchers operate very, very close to zero, in fact, because thanks to things like the milk industry and the leather industry, we effectively overproduce cows. So in those sorts of situations, whether or not you're on the right side of the marketplace is effectively your entire deal. There's so many gentlemen in that zone that sort of don't care that they're breaking even, and so many cows coming in to the system that there's sort of nothing to do there. So if you had a situation where you were operating at 7% margins and there was a 5% overhead, and that 5% overhead went to a 1% overhead, then you would go from 7 to 11% margins, and almost 50% or more. So the range is enormous and highly individualized, but it's a very large effect.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And with the current economy and inflation and all of that that's going on right now, I can imagine it could really be a game changer for businesses that are in that commodity space, not just farmers, but whoever's in that space.
Well, absolutely. One of the things that sort of defines how much production happens is how interesting it is to be in a productive industry. Again, these are low margin businesses. So getting yourself into energy production or mining or growing things, it doesn't have to be a passion project. I mean, these are sensible businesses, but they are sensible businesses. Maybe you could go to medical school and put on a slate and be a doctor, or get an office job. There are a lot of options, basically. And so we have the number of these people that we do based on the kinds of returns that we currently see. If those returns go up 10%, it wouldn't be necessarily the case that we'd have 10% more of these people. We might have 1 or 5 or maybe 100% more of those people if the margins were that much higher. But 10% is a very low end. If those margins increase 30, 40, 50, 60%, then we should expect a lot more people to get involved in making stuff, and
Right.
with much more energy, food,
Yeah. Yeah.
lumber, and so on.
So I'm just thinking about the effects of this could lead to even more innovative products and things because people will be more incentivized to do it because there'll be more margin for profit.
Right. Well, that's what we see in systems that have better marketplaces. We see a incredible flourishing of economic opportunity. In fact, the Renaissance is reasonably credited to the creation of the market model that we use today.
Mm.
The city-states of northern Italy had sort of coffee houses and chalkboards and the Italian big talking, thing. And somewhere somebody came up with the idea of writing up in a publicly visible spot where the deals were happening, what deals were occurring. And that's where the stock ticker got rolling.
Okay.
And that resulted in city-states like Venice and Florence and so on becoming the hub of Mediterranean trade, which was an enormous fraction of the European Northern African economy. And so having that run through Northern Italy instead of Western Turkey, where Constantinople is where the headquarters had been, meant that suddenly those places were very, very rich. And they used their vast wealth to create the artwork and architecture that we're now very familiar with, and also fund the outpouring in science and other things that came with it, that then led to further upgrades in shipbuilding and warfare and ultimately, all the stuff that we see around us today. So again, the 20th century, we saw a competition of market systems of the communist countries, essentially saying that, bureaucrats can do it better. And it was a disaster.
Right.
East and West Berlin were different essentially in no other way than whether or not they had access to functioning price discovery markets or non-functioning price discovery markets. And they had to build a wall around the people that didn't have them. And even after they built that wall, people risked the lives of themselves and their families to get from one to the other, because there's an enormous economic opportunity available if you can know what the value of different options are, and do so at a very low cost.
Yeah, absolutely. So history tends to repeat itself. So I'd love to hear like what your vision is for this, because it sounds like it could have a tremendous impact on our entire global economy.
So yeah, that informs a lot of how I'm trying to sell this notion. I'm effectively just planting seeds, because these are kind of Jack and the Beanstalk type beans. The history of intermarket competition is that people will risk their lives to get to better marketplaces. So the markets that we have right now, while there are regional and sort of national markets, France has its own corn market and so on. What winds up happening because we have global trade and we have global communication, is that one of these marketplaces will become the benchmark. And so if Chicago and France disagree about what the price of butter is, it's because France is wrong.
Okay.
And you might, culturally think that France would have a better handle on butter than Chicago does, but that's not how it is, because the benchmark's in Chicago. Or if Pittsburgh and London have a difference of opinion about the price of steel, it's because Pittsburgh is wrong. That the fact that they're, centuries of a major steel foundry doesn't matter. The steel benchmarks in London. Everyone who wants to trade goes to there to figure out their pricing. Whatever they say is whatever we know. And so because of that, if you set up a marketplace that has better economics, then what has a very good chance of happening is that you can establish the new benchmark. And so if somebody starts this stuff in the United States or in Tierra del Fuego or, Oceania or Central Asia, because of that sort of intermarket competitional dynamics where my system is cheaper to operate and does offer people these much better deals, as long as the access costs don't exceed the use costs, as it were, you'll get to take over benchmarking. And so getting this thing established, getting people using it, demonstrating that it works, and demonstrating that the values work out the way the math says that they do, one, creates a strong sort of vacuum suction of whatever industry you've started it in to start driving that market to become the benchmark for that industry. But two, because while there's sort of a parochialism of small differences where, people in, say, the cheese market will tell you that it has no relationship at all to the milk market. These things are all broadly traded in pretty similar ways through pretty similar market mechanisms. And so if you're in copper, the people in tin are going to say, hey, why did copper suddenly get massively more productive and a lot cheaper to trade and a lot higher rates of return for, investing and so on? Why can't I have that too? And so will the people in the corn market and the wheat market and the lumber and wool and everything else. And so we've seen the incredible potential growth rate of companies with the internet, global communication, and so on. Europe, changed its standard of markets in the days of ship and sail in just decades. So we should probably expect to see an even faster transformation from sort of first planting to general assumption.
Yeah, this is great. And I love big thinkers. Really quickly, I'd love to hear how, this idea come about. Or maybe there's not a quick answer to that, but
effectively it was an accident.
Okay. I love it.
I'm a recreational mathematician. I was looking at ways to find consensus through network communication. I was thinking about problems like Internet of Things, where you have large numbers of, dumb sensors, or internal corporate communication, project management type things, for a number of startups, some of whom become quite large and when you get out of the same room with everybody else, communication pretty much inevitably starts clogging up, and people have various mechanisms that we use to deal with those, and my observation is that they all suck. And so thinking about coming up with a mathematical formalism for these, and seeing if I could find general solutions. I was sort of taking some sabbatical time. It seemed like an interesting problem to think about. I found an approach based in game theory to find solutions to those kinds of problems. And then sort of as a next stage, as another interesting thing, it occurred to me that you could turn this approach of communication into a marketplace if you could effectively get it to pay for itself. And so this sort of bending a thing back upon itself, in computer science we call this recursion, adding this layer of recursion to the system, it looked like a very interesting thing. Like maybe I could find that solution. And so I decided to work on it, and I did. And then once I had done that, analyzing the algorithmic properties of that solution was suddenly, kind of my holy crap moment of, I was expecting to get something that at best would be at parity to the system in place. And instead, what I found is a system which at scale is thousands of times more efficient
Wow.
than what we've got right now.
Wow. I love the curiosity, because that's really the asking what I'm sure you did this, asked yourself lots of questions on how you could solve this problem to get where you are. So.
Well, and actually a neighbor of mine, he was a friend who was a neighbor at the time. He asked one of the critical questions.
Oh, interesting.
Yes. You can't always come up with all the questions yourself.
Yeah. It's key, though. It really is key in innovation. And, we want to change the world that we live in and make things better. We need innovative people like yourself to help change happen.
Yeah, and actually the insight about the importance of questions with, AI is currently feeling its oats again, and that's one of the critical problems in sort of the machine learning space is finding good questions to ask. And so the current round of AI, probably the most, I guess, dramatic success of them so far has been the deep fake technology, which shows up in movies now from time to time. And that's the ability to have a computer essentially put somebody else's face on a different actor's face. But the way that works essentially combines facial recognition, which was getting pretty good, along with sort of picture sharpening, which was also getting pretty good. And so what you do is you train up the thing to learn what human faces look like, but you only teach it what one human face looks like. And so it takes your face or my face or something, and it says, oh, that looks kind of like a human face, but it doesn't look exactly like famous actor X. Let me make that face look as much like famous actor X's face as I can, because I know that all human faces are just this one famous actor. And that was just a question. That was like, understanding, like those two technologies were already pretty mature.
Uh-huh.
But nobody had thought to put them together. And as a
Mm.
result, we get this thing where now you can't really trust video anymore.
Right.
Because,
You don't know who's in it.
because because it's not that hard to train up a sort of facial recognition system, but with only one face in it,
Right.
and have it go to town. And you could create an entire crowd of twins or something where it would just be like, oh, this shot of the stands at Wimbledon looks like it has some human faces in it, but obviously it wasn't done very well because all human faces look like Noah Healy, and so I'll just change them all so that they all look like that now.
Yeah, it's amazing what we can do, what our technology has the ability to do now. So, and I love that you've used that with what you've put out, what this whole concept is. Tell us, so this has been really great. Tell us the best way to connect with you. Who do you want to connect with you? Like who are the best people or connections for you to be in front of so that they know?
Yeah, sure. Well, I guess first, I'm happy to connect with anybody that sort of 6 degrees of separation, seeds
Sure.
can be planted almost anywhere. So I'm on LinkedIn. I'm Noah Healy on LinkedIn. There's a website, Coordisc, COORDISC, which has a lot of information about this system and how it works. And people can reach out to me by email, noahphealy@yahoo.com. That's fine too. But specifically for sort of the fallow ground, people who are operating futures, forwards, indices in the commodity space have the regulatory and customer list that could slot in my piece to what they have. To that's where the synergy lies for me.
Okay. Got it. Thank you so much so thank you for being on today and just sharing your knowledge and your innovativeness with us, because it's really fascinating. And I want to encourage our listeners to look Noah up on LinkedIn. I know he's active on LinkedIn. I've connected with him there. Go to his website. We'll have all that in the show notes, and connect and learn a little bit more. So thanks again for being on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Are you ready to break through the barriers that are holding you back and reach a higher level in your business in just 4 hours? Be sure to click the link today and join other high-achieving professionals that have worked with Kimberly Lebbing to accelerate their success.